Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome everyone to today's Torah study. We continue with the book of Devarim or Deuteronomy. And today's Torah portion is called Shoftim. Shoftim, which means judges, can be translated as judges. And it's found in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 16, verse 18, all the way through chapter 21, verse 9. And also today is the fourth reading of consolations, the readings of consolation in Isaiah, which is going to be chapter 51, verse 12 through chapter 52, verse 12. And for those that are connected for the first time, I'm Dr. Nereida Romero, pastor of Yeshua Ner Tamid in Brandon, Florida. So let me say the blessing for today's Torah portion. It says, Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us in his commandments and commanded us to engrave ourselves in the words of the Torah. Amen. So again, today is Shoftim, chapter 16 of Deuteronomy, starting in verse 18. And today I'll be using the Complete Jewish Study Bible. That's the one you got. Okay. So starting on verse 18, it says, you are to appoint Shoftim, judges and officers for all your gates in the cities Adonai your God is giving you, tribe by tribe, and they are to judge the people with righteous judgment. And so again, just at the get-go, the purpose of having these judges or these officials, these officers, is so that justice and righteousness can be established in the community. So there is order. The purpose of all this, and as we continue to read, we'll see that a lot of things are going to affect this order in the community, this justice in the community. So he's going to start out with saying judges and officers in all your gates. And something that we have to remember is that during this time in the cultures in the cities, the gates to the entrance of the city served as a place where people would meet, and they would have like the elderly people or judges, and they would bring all the issues that were going on in the community. Any business transaction, anything that was official would be brought to the gates of the city, and there they would make decisions. So that's why it says that you're to appoint judges and officers in all your gates. And verse 19 says, you are not to distort justice or show favoritism. So now this is addressing the judges and the officers in the way they are supposed to behave so that justice and righteousness can be maintained. You are not to distort justice or show favoritism, and you are not to accept a bribe, for a gift blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of even the upright. Justice, only justice you must pursue. And that is a phrase that is given to all lawyers when they graduate and they come out and they have their diploma. And usually this is like the motto of lawyers: justice, only justice you must pursue, which I wish all of them would do that, so that you will live and inherit the land Adonai your God is giving you. And now he starts talking about things that are related to idolatry, because if there's idolatry within the community, that is going to break the order, the justice that's supposed to be there, because they're following Torah, they're following the covenant. It says you're not to plant any sort of tree as a sacred pole beside the altar of Adonai your God that you will make for yourselves. So one of the things that when the temple was standing, there were not to be any trees around the temple, because the trees were seen as places where people would do cult to the pagan gods, as it was a places of worship. So around the temple, you were never to see any trees. Now the king usually had a garden, and so he would have all his fruit trees and other types of trees. But within the gates or within the area of the temple, there were not to be any trees. And if you go into Isaiah, we know that trees represent people. So therefore, we're supposed to be the trees of righteousness. Okay, so in that sense, if there's going to be any trees, it's supposed to be us, because we are trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord. But because right now in the Temple Mount, even though the temple's not there, we know that it's mostly occupied by Muslims. And what have the Muslims done? They have put a whole bunch of trees around the area because they know that the Torah says that that's prohibited. Verse 22, likewise, do not set up a standing stone. Adonai, your God, hates such things. So there's not to be any symbols of idolatry within the community that serves the Lord. Because again, this disrupts the order, disrupts the justice. Chapter 17, you are not to sacrifice to Adonai, your God, a cow or sheep that has a defect or anything wrong with it. That would be an abomination to Adonai, your God. Again, if you're going to bring something to the Lord, you bring something that is perfect, something that is for him. So therefore, you should make sure that it doesn't have any sort of defect. If there is found among you within any of your gates in any city that Adonai, your God, gives you, a man or woman who does what Adonai, your God, sees as wicked, transgressing his covenant by going and serving other gods and worshiping them, the sun, the moon, or anything in the sky, something I have forbidden, and it is told to you, or you hear about it, then you are to investigate the matter diligently. So here again is about worshiping other gods or idols, and there's a name for that. It's called syncretism. Syncretism is when you mix the things that the Lord said to do for him with things that the pagan nations do. In other words, you're mixing the worship of pagan gods with worship to Hashem, the God of Israel. So he's saying you cannot do that. Verse 4, and it is told to you, or you hear about it, then you're to investigate the matter diligently. If it is true, if it is confirmed that such detestable things are being done in Israel, then you're to bring the man or woman who has done this wicked thing to your city gates and stone that man or woman to death. In other words, if there's somebody in the community and you see that they're committing idolatry, you just don't go and kill them. This has to go to a process, a judicial system. That's why it starts speaking about judges in your cities. You just can't take a person and stone them because they're committing idolatry or doing things that the Lord has prohibited. All these things had to go through the court, through the judicial system. And if it was found true, then the punishment was that they had to be stoned. Verse 6, this death sentence is to be carried out only if there was testimony from 2 or 3 witnesses. You can never do it with just one person testifying. You always have to have at least 2 or 3 people. He may not be sentenced to death on the testimony of only one witness. The witnesses are to be the first to stone him to death. Afterwards, all the people are to stone him. Thus you will put an end to this wickedness among you. So why the severity of the punishment? Death, because it was basically being unfaithful to the covenant. It's spiritual adultery. If anyone committed idolatry against the Lord, that was seen as something punishable by death. Why? Because that was the only way you could assure that that issue was being cut right from the root, so it would not spread among the community. Because remember that what's being said in this Torah portion, most of all, is speaking about justice and righteousness, because those 2 things are the foundation of the throne of Hashem and of the kingdom. Therefore, this is what's going to establish order and peace in the community. Verse 8, if a case comes before you at your city gate, which is too difficult for you to judge, concerning bloodshed, civil suit, personal injury, or any other controversial issue, you are to get up, go to the place which Adonai your God will choose, and appear before the Kohanim, or the priest, who are Leviim, and the judge in office at that time. So now he's going to, what he's addressing is, because the judicial system of Israel consisted of what's called the Sanhedrin. And that Sanhedrin was divided in 3 main divisions. In the local community, there were at least 3 judges. Any issues like these, which are being mentioned here, bloodshed, civil suit, personal injury, or any other controversial issue, were brought to these 3 judges. If these 3 judges could not come to a conclusion, could not decide on what to do with about the verdict or the punishment or whatever, then this had to be brought to the higher courts, which were in Jerusalem themselves. And within Jerusalem, in the area of the temple, there were 2 courts. That was called the Sanhedrin Katan, which means the small Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin Hagadol, which means the large or supreme Sanhedrin. And so it would go from one court to the other until it was completely resolved. So that's why it says, if you can't resolve this, then you would have to go to the place which Adonai will choose, which we know is Jerusalem. You are to take care to act according to all their instructions. Verse 11, in accordance with the Torah, they teach you, you are to carry out the judgment they render, not turning aside to the right or the left from the verdict they declare to you. Because the Sanhedrin was based on the Torah. All decisions, anything pertaining to law or halakha, had to be Torah based. You couldn't come with any other conclusions based on the Roman Empire or Greek laws or anything else. It was always based on the Torah. Verse 12, anyone presumptuous enough not to pay attention to the Cohen, the priest, appointed there to serve Adonai your God or to the judge, that person must die. Thus you will exterminate such wickedness from Israel. All the people will hear about it and be afraid to continue acting presumptuously. Now here, what I read from the commentaries, it said that it's referring to a judge. If a judge did not follow the rulings of all the other judges and they wanted to judge differently from the main opinion, that person had to be also punished or exterminated because he was not following all the rulings of the rest of the judges. Because we have to remember, like I was saying, the Sanhedrin Katan, the small Sanhedrin within the temple, consisted of 23 judges. So we have the local judges, which are 3, the small Sanhedrin, which is 23, and then the large Sanhedrin, which consisted of 70 judges. And these judges were made up of Cohen, priest, and judges, lay people. Okay, so they were the ones to decide based on Torah any issues that were brought to them because locally it could not be resolved. And it had to be exactly according to what they sentenced or whatever verdict they gave. And another thing is that we have to remember that this is something that was appointed by God. This is the judicial system of Israel. Therefore, when they were together deciding based on Torah, they were all inspired by the Holy Spirit to come with decisions, even though they were men, common men. Once they were in that environment within the Temple Mount, within the temple area, they were inspired by the Torah and the Holy Spirit to come with the right decision. Now, after they came out of there and they did other things, that was their problem. But once they were in there, the purpose was to fulfill what the Torah said, in, whether for civil issues or criminal issues or whatever it was that had to be resolved. So they were the highest authority in terms of judicial decisions within Israel. Verse 14 of chapter 17. When you have entered the land Adonai your God is giving you, have taken possession of it and are living there, you may say, I want to have a king over me like all the other nations around me. So now he's going to talk about the role and the function of a king, because remember, he first establishes judges, and then there's going to speak about a king. Now we know because of what happened with Saul. Remember when the people wanted to have a king, and Samuel got all frustrated because Hashem is their king. And so when they proposed to have a king, Samuel felt like it was an insult to God. God is your king. Why do you want a human king? But they wanted to be like the other nations. That's the problem that Israel has always had. They always wanted to be like the other nations when really the Lord has separated Israel from everybody else to be different, to be his people, to show, represent the Lord with the Torah and with the covenant. But he says here, when you have entered the land of Adonai your God is giving you, and you have taken possession of it and are living there, you may say, I want to have a king over me like all the other nations around me. In that event, you must appoint as king the one whom Adonai your God will choose. So to start with, it has to be someone that the Lord chooses. Now we know that with Saul, God was kind of like, but he still allowed them to choose Saul, right? Because they looked at him, they saw the people saw his physical attributes more than anything else. Because I don't know if you know that Saul was very tall. so tall that he stood out from the other men. So when they looked at him, said, "This is our guy," okay, just because he was a tall guy. And we know what happened. He wasn't the best king. He must be one of your king's men. This king you appoint over you, you are forbidden to appoint a foreigner over you who is not your king's man. So it has to be a king from Israel. However, he is not to acquire many horses for himself or have the people return to Egypt to obtain more horses, inasmuch as Adonai told you never to go back that way again. So why does he mention this? Because during that time, Egypt was the nation that had the best horses. And so people, the kings would go and send people to buy horses from there. But when he says that you are never to go back that way, what he really means is if you go to Egypt, you're not to stay in Egypt permanently. You can go and come back, but you can never go to stay because, I mean, you know how much it took him to get the people out of there? So he says, don't go back to be permanent residents of Egypt. And then he says, verse 17, likewise, he is not to acquire many wives for himself so that his heart will not turn away. So another thing is not to have many wives. Why? Because one of the things that kings did during this time, during the ancient Near East as a culture, was that they would marry with many women from different nations as part of a treaty to maintain a relationship with other nations for economy purposes, financial relationship, peace, and things like that. So that's the way they would deal with that, by marrying the daughters of other kings and other emperors and people to maintain the status quo among themselves. But the problem with that was, and we know the best example is Solomon. Solomon did everything that the Lord says not to do. He had a lot of horses, he had a lot of money, he had a lot of wives. I think there were like 1,000 women, of which 300 were wives and I think 700 were concubines. Hello. But anyway, we know that at the end, these women that came from other nations also got him involved in pagan worship. Why? Because the problem was these women would bring their culture, their customs, their worship, the way they worship their gods. And so Solomon eventually gave in to all these things to keep his ladies happy. And he is not to acquire excessive quantities of silver and gold. And so we know that Solomon unfortunately did all these things. But then he says in verse 18, when he has come to occupy the throne of his kingdom, he is to write a copy of this Torah for himself in a scroll from the one that priests and Levites use. Because you remember that the Torah, the stones, the tablets were in the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, well, in the first temple. And so the king was supposed to make a copy of that original one. And it says in verse 19, it is to remain with him, and he is to read in it every day as long as he lives, so that he will learn to fear Adonai his God and keep all the words of this Torah and these laws and obey them, so that he will not think he is better than his kinsmen, and so that he will not turn aside either to the right or to the left from the commandments. In this way, he will prolong his reign and that of his children in Israel. In other words, the Lord says there has to be restrictions on the kings. You cannot have too much of this and you can't have too much of that, because then you'll become haughty, you'll become prideful, and then you'll think you're better than the rest of the people of the community. And also here, by writing a copy of the Torah and being subject to the Torah, he's saying that the king is not above the Torah. The king is under the Torah. The king has to follow the Torah. And also in a commentary that I read, it kind of gives you an idea of that's the way the Messianic kingdom is going to be when Yeshua comes back. It's going to be all based on Torah. The Lord, Yeshua is going to be following Torah and not be worrying about getting a whole bunch of horses and all this other stuff. Chapter 18. Then it starts talking about another area of authority. So we have the judges and the officers, we have the kings, and now the issue is to look into the Kohanim, or the priests, and the Levites. And it says, the Kohanim, or the priests, who are Leviim, Levites, and indeed the whole tribe of Levi, are not to have a share or an inheritance with Israel. Instead, their support will come from the food offered by fire to Adonai and from whatever else becomes his. So we know that the Levites, especially the priests, because we know that priests are Levites, but not all the Levites are priests. Okay, priests are Levites, but not all the Levites are priests. And they will not get a share of property of inheritance like the rest of the tribes. Therefore, the people that when they brought offerings to the Lord is going to share his offerings with them. This is going to be a way of compensating them, a way so they can also maintain their families, because the Levites had families. They were married, they had kids, so they had to take care of them. Verse 2, they will have no inheritance with their brothers because Adonai is their inheritance, as he has said to them. The priest will have the right to receive from the people, from those offering a sacrifice, whether ox or sheep, the shoulder, the jaws, and the stomach. So there are certain parts of the offering that are going to be given to the priest that's officiating that offering. Why? Because he's working. Therefore, that's going to be his compensation so that he can share it with his family. Verse 4. You will also give him the first fruits of your grain, new wine, and olive oil. So the first fruits went to the priest, and the first of the fleece of your sheep. For Adonai your God has chosen him from all your tribes to stand and serve in the name of Adonai, him and his sons forever. So what do we have? That the first fruits go to the priest, which is this, remember, we were saying that this is what's called a teruma. Teruma is that first offering that you take out of everything that you have of your first fruits and what your tithing and whatever, and it's given to the priest. Once that is separated, then you separate the tithe that's going to go to the Levites. And then the Levites themselves have to separate a tithe from that tithe and give it to the priest. Verse 6. If a Levite from one of your towns anywhere in Israel where he is living comes highly motivated to the place which Adonai will choose, then he will serve there in the name of Adonai his God, just like his kinsmen, the Levites who stand and serve in the presence of Adonai. So that's making reference to the Levites that live in other cities, because you have to understand that not all the Levites lived in Jerusalem. There were certain families of Levites that lived in Jerusalem. And so when they served in the temple, they were right there. And remember that these guys, when they're getting there, when they're serving, they would receive from whatever offerings were brought or whatever tithe were brought. But if there were Levites in other towns, because you have to remember that all the tribes had to set aside some land so that Levites could live there. The land was not of the Levites, but it was kind of like giving them a share of the land. Okay, you can have your house here and your family live here. And so you have to remember that in the temple, the Levites and the priests were divided in groups of 24 groups, 24 families. And these 24 families, they took a group of 7 every week, and they would go to the temple and serve. So it wasn't a rotational thing. One family, the next week, another family, and so forth. Not everybody was serving at the same time. The only time that all the Levites and all the priests served in the temple was when there was the high holidays or the festivals, like Sukkot, Passover, where they had so many people visiting Jerusalem, then they would call up everybody and everybody would have to work. While there were no feasts going on, just the regular weeks, then they would have only one family serving for a week. They would go back home, and then another family of priests and Levites would come and serve. Okay, so this was on a rotational basis. So what he's trying to say here is that that Levite that came from a different city to serve that week, that was his week, would participate of all the benefits like the ones that were always there. You wouldn't make a difference, right? Because they came, that was their week to work, and they got the same things as the other ones. So it says, verse 8, such a Levite will receive the same share as they do, in addition to what he may receive from selling his inherited ancestral property. When you enter the land Adonai your God is giving you, you're not to learn how to follow the abominable practices of those nations, So we have gone through all the different levels of authority. We have the judges with the officers, we have the kings, and we have the Levites and the priests. Now he's telling the people, once they enter the land, they cannot do the same things that the people that were there were doing, because that's the reason why God was taking those people out and replacing them with the children of Israel. Verse 10, there must not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through fire. Remember the sacrifice of children to Molech. Molech was the king, the god of, I think, Moab. And their custom was to sacrifice their first child. They would sacrifice their first child as a token so that God would bless them with more children and bring them more prosperity. So God's saying, you don't do that. First of all, God never asked for any human sacrifice. And another thing is, if you read in the books of the Kings and in Samuel, you'll see that there was a point where Israel did do this. This did happen, unfortunately. So he says, you're not to pass your children through fire. A diviner, a soothsayer, an enchanter, a sorcerer, a spellcaster, a consulter of ghosts or spirits, or necromancer. You're not to do any of these things. All this is idolatry, and all this goes against the Torah. For whoever does these things is detestable to Adonai, and because of these abominations, Adonai your God is driving them out ahead of you. You must be wholehearted with Adonai your God. When you serve the Lord, you have to serve him with all your heart. You cannot leave one tiny little space for anything else that is not the Lord. Because if you leave that there as a seed, that will cause you to walk away from the things of the Lord. Verse 14, for these nations which you're about to dispossess, listen to soothsayers and diviners, but you, Adonai your God, does not allow you to do this. And then he says, you don't have these guys guessing or telling a fortune or whatever, fortune tellers or sorcerers or whatever. Why? Because he's going to give you prophets, true prophets of the Lord. He says, verse 15, Adonai will raise up for you a prophet like me from among yourselves, from your own kinsmen. Now, many people, we understand that this is also referring to Yeshua, because remember, Yeshua is brought up in a manner like Moses. So he says, Adonai will raise up for you a prophet like me. Remember, Moses is the one who's speaking. From among yourselves, from your own kinsmen. You are to pay attention to him. Just as when you were assembled at Horeb and requested Adonai your God, don't let me hear the voice of Adonai my God anymore, or let me see this great fire ever again. If I do, I will die. So this is remembering when they were at Mount Sinai and the people were afraid of listening to the voice of God. And they say, Moses, you go, you listen, and then you come back and tell us what he said. So basically that is the role of a prophet. The prophet listens to God and brings back the words of God. Verse 17, on that occasion, Adonai said to me, they are right in what they are saying. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their kinsmen. I will put my words in his mouth. This is the definition of a true prophet. I will put my words in his mouth, in my prophet's mouth, and he will tell them everything I order him. So a prophet that speaks only speaks the words that God has given him, and it's according to Torah. Therefore, like I was saying last night, anybody out there that calls themselves a prophet, first of all, don't even listen to them, because a true prophet is not promoting themselves around everywhere. The second thing is, if they speak, they only can speak what God tells them to speak, and they cannot say any more than that. So therefore, I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I order him. Whoever doesn't listen to my words, which he will speak in my name, will have to account for himself to me. So that's the first thing. A prophet doesn't come announcing themselves. If the Lord gives a word to a prophet, that prophet goes directly to either the people or a person and speaks exactly what the Lord said. Anything more than that or less than that is idolatry. And some of the questions from last night is, do we have prophets today? Yes, we do have prophets, not in the same manner they used to be, but there are prophets out there. And you're going to say, well, who are they? God knows. They're not announcing themselves. Like I said, anybody that calls themselves a prophet or prophetess, don't even listen to them, because God is the one that chooses them, and it's not something to be proclaimed, hey, everywhere. Hey, I'm Prophet Nereida, I'm Prophet this, I'm Prophet that. No, God himself calls them, gives them a word, and then they speak the word that God says, and it has to align completely with the Torah. If it doesn't align with Torah, he or she is not a true prophet. Verse 20. But if a prophet presumptuously speaks a word in my name, which I didn't order him to say, or if he speaks in the name of other gods, then that prophet must die. So I'm assuming there'll be a lot of dead people today. Verse 21, you may be wondering, how are we to know if a word has not been spoken by Adonai? When a prophet speaks in the name of Adonai and the prediction does not come true, that is, the word is not fulfilled, then Adonai did not speak that word. The prophet who said it spoke presumptuously. You have nothing to fear from him. So one of the indications that it's a true prophet is whatever that prophet says will be fulfilled. But then again, remember that last Torah portion we read that sometimes the Lord uses false prophets that can do wonders and miracles to test our hearts, to know if we really are in covenant with him, if we really know his Torah, if we really know his word. Because someone can come and say something and do all these wondrous miracles and whatever, but if whatever they're saying does not align with the Torah, don't believe them. Again, a true prophet of God is chosen by God, is not proclaiming himself or herself that he's a prophet. And number two, speaks only what the Lord has given that individual to speak. And number three, it has to align with Torah. That's why it's important to know Torah, because if they come and say anything and you're not sure if that's in the Bible or not, other issues are going to happen. Chapter 20. When Adonai your God cuts off the nations whose land Adonai your God is giving you, and you take their place and settle in their cities and houses, you are to set aside 3 cities for yourselves in your land that Adonai your God is giving you to possess. Remember, this is what's called the cities of refuge. Divide the territory of your land, which Adonai your God is having you inherit, into 3 parts, and prepare the roads so that any killer can flee to these cities. The killer who will live if he flees there is someone who has killed his fellow member of the community by mistake, who did not hate him in the past. So this is accidental manslaughter. I mean, you killed somebody, but it was an accident. You didn't mean to hurt them. It just was an accident. But then again, until a judgment is made, the family can come and try to kill that individual because they killed a family member. So what he's saying is there's going to be a place that if something, an accidental death happens, you're going to go there as a city of refuge. A judgment has to be made. Everybody, all the judges have to go out and investigate if this truly was an accident. And in the meantime, you just stay there. This is to avoid that the family comes and as a revenge tries to kill the person that killed accidentally the other person, to avoid shedding of innocent blood. Verse 5, an example would be if a man goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood and takes a stroke with the axe to fell a tree, but the head of the axe flies off the handle, hits his neighbor and kills him. That's an accident. Then he is to flee to one of these cities and live there. Otherwise, the next of kin avenger in the heat of his anger may pursue the killer, overtake him because the distance to the city of refuge is long, and strike him dead, even though he didn't deserve to die, inasmuch as he hadn't hated him in the past. This is why I'm ordering you to set aside for just yourself 3 cities. Why? Again, remember what we started with the beginning of the Torah portion, justice and righteousness. This is a way of maintaining justice and righteousness in the community and order, and to prevent the shedding of innocent blood. And everything has to be done in a court system before any decisions are made. Verse 8, if Adonai your God expands your territory as he swore to your ancestors that he would, and gives you all the land he promised to give to your ancestors, provided you keep and observe all these commandments I'm giving you today, loving Adonai your God and always following his ways, then you are to add 3 more cities for yourself besides these 3, so that innocent blood will not be shed in the land Adonai your God is giving you as an inheritance, and thus blood guilt be on you. So afterwards, once they establish the first 3 cities, and as they keep expanding, then they have to establish 3 more. So there's going to be a total of 6 cities of refuge. Verse 11, however, if someone hates his fellow member of the community, lies in wait for him, attacks him, strikes him a death blow, and then flees into one of these cities, then the leaders of his own town are to send and bring him back from there and hand him over to the next of kin avenger to be put to death. In other words, someone that kills another person with intention, it was planned, that individual's committing murder. And a murderous person, the punishment is death, because it was done knowingly. It was something that was planned. Verse 13, you are not to pity him. Rather, you must put an end to the shedding of innocent blood in Israel. Then things will go well with you. So again, all these things go through a court system. If the person comes into the city of refuge and says that it was an accident, and then it turns out after the investigation that it was not an accident, that individual has to be turned over to the family of the individual that was murdered, and they have to kill him. That was the end of that. You kill a person intentionally, the punishment is death. If it's accidental, then you go to a city of refuge, a judgment is made. If you're found innocent, then you stay there until the high priest dies, and then you can go out. Okay. Verse 14, you are not to move your neighbor's boundary marker from the place where people put it long ago in the inheritance soon to be yours in the land Adonai your God is giving you to possess. So landmarks were not to be moved. You couldn't take a little bitty more piece of land from your neighbor when it wasn't yours. Why? This is going to cause issues. This is going to cause violence. This is going to cause feuds, and people could easily kill each other because just a little piece of land. So remember the issues about the cities of refuge, about judgment, to see if it's really true that someone killed someone accidentally or was intentional. So he says, avoiding this issue, don't move any landmarks. Just leave them where they are. That's the people's property. Don't be doing encroachment upon something that's not yours. Verse 15, one witness alone will not be sufficient to convict the person of any offense or sin of any kind. The matter will be established only if there are 2 or 3 witnesses testifying against him. Again, you cannot do a judgment based on 1 witness. There has to be minimum 2 or 3 people. But then again, keeping the same line of what he's saying, if a malicious witness comes forward and gives false testimony against someone, then both the men involved in the controversy have to stand before Adonai, before the priests and judges in office at that time. The judges are to investigate carefully. If they find that the witness is lying and is given false testimony against his brother, you are to do to him what he intended to do to his brother. In this way, you'll put an end to such wickedness among you. So anything that was the start of any wickedness, of anything that would disrupt the order, the justice of the community, all that had to be cut from the root. Because if not, it would keep spreading and it would mess up the whole community. Verse 20, those who remain will hear about it, be afraid, and no longer commit such wickedness among you. Show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot, which means that you have to give a monetary compensation equivalent to the offense. A life for a life, if it's intentional, someone kills somebody else intentionally, that individual had to pay with their life. But if you accidentally hit someone and the eye got messed up, they lost their eye, you don't go and then take out the eye of the other person. You had to do some monetary compensation of the value of that individual's eye. And then again, this had to be taken to the judges. This had to be presented, and then the judges would decide how much compensation would be given to individual. If there was a loss of an eye, of a tooth, or a hand, a foot, or anything of value, that had to be compensated in an equal manner. You couldn't pay more than what it was valued, and you couldn't pay less of the value. It had to be equivalent. Chapter 20. When you go out to fight your enemies and see horses, chariots, and a force larger than yours, you're not to be afraid of them. So now we're going to go over some laws pertaining to war. Because Adonai, your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, is with you. When you are about to go into battle, the priest is to come forward and address the people. There was a priest that was chosen, what would have been called like a warrior priest. And this priest would be the one supporting the troops, giving them encouragement and speaking to them. He should tell them, listen, Israel, you are about to do battle against your enemies. Don't be faint-hearted or afraid. Don't be alarmed or frightened by them, because Adonai, your God, is going with you to fight on your behalf against your enemies and give you victory. And I was saying last night that if you ever go through the history of Israel, the wars that have happened in Israel, you will see how many times the Lord has really fought for them. Some of the things that happen logistically make no sense. Like the war, the Yom Kippur War, the 6-Day War, all these wars. Most of the time, Israel is outnumbered by their enemies. Their enemies sometimes have better equipment, better technology to fight, and yet Israel wins. It doesn't make any sense in the natural, but we know that the Lord is fighting for them. Why? Because they believe what the Torah says. Not only that, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures where you have the IDF soldiers, and they all got their rifles and guns and whatever. And if it's Shabbat, in a corner, you see a group of them, at least 10 of them, with their talid, with their tefillin, and they're praying the Siddur. While others are, blasting, you see rockets flying all over the place, they're praying the Siddur. They have their talid on, they have their tefillin in the midst of war. Why? Because they believe that verse that the God of Israel is with them and he's the one that's fighting the wars for them. Because it would not make sense, all the things that happen, even the enemy. I know that, I think like a year or two ago, it came out that one of the enemies from the other side said that the only thing they could think is that when those rockets would go, that the God of Israel is really fighting for the people, because in the mid of the air, all these things, they would shoot, I don't know how many rockets, and it wouldn't kill anybody. It would hit the ground and make some damage to structure, but it wouldn't kill the people. And they're like, and not only that, sometimes you read and the enemy is shooting all these rockets to Israel, and the rockets, they turn around and hit them. I mean, tell me, is God with Israel or not with Israel? It's unbelievable. But it's because of what he says here. It says, because Adonai, your God, is going with you to fight on your behalf against your enemies and give you victory. And we also need to apply that to our lives. We need to know that it's God of Israel who's fighting for us our battles. If we trust him and if we walk in obedience, if we follow his Torah, we are in covenant. If we are doing our part, he's going to be doing his part to defend us and give us victory. Verse 5, then the officials will speak to the soldiers. They are to say, is there a man here who has built a new house but hasn't dedicated it yet? He should go back home now, otherwise he may die fighting and another man will dedicate it. So if you have a brand new home and you haven't lived in it long enough, he says, hey, forget about the war, go home and enjoy your house. If there is a man here who has planted a vineyard but hasn't yet made use of its fruit, he should go back home, otherwise he may die fighting and another man will use it. You still haven't tasted the wine from your vineyard. Hey, go home and enjoy it. If there's a man here who is engaged to a woman but hasn't married her yet, he should go back home, otherwise he may die fighting and another man will marry her. The same thing, go enjoy your wife. And remember that for Israel, honeymoon is a whole year. So go and enjoy your marriage, enjoy your wife. The officials will then add to what they have said to the soldiers. Is there a man here who is afraid and faint-hearted? He should go back home, otherwise his fear may demoralize his comrades as well. When the officials have finished speaking with the soldiers, commanders are to be appointed to lead the army. So what's, in a way, like I was saying last night, these men, they have been called up to war. They're there, and then they say all these things. If you have a house, if you have you're engaged, you have a vineyard, you're afraid, go back home. And so when they start coming back home, if any of them do go back and they come to town, people are not going to question them because they know that they're coming back for either one of those issues. Either they have a home, a new home, a vineyard, they're engaged, or they're faint-hearted. But in the commentary I was reading that many times the individuals would not want to go to war because if they had sinned or done some sort of offense against the God and had not had the opportunity to repair that issue, they were afraid that they would die with that sin in their lives. And so the Torah, to make it, to be sensitive to people, they don't outrightly say, oh, because you're a sinner and you want to make things right, then you go back home and resolve this issue. So people would not judge the individual that's going back home and thinking, oh, he's coming back because he's a sinner. So God gives all these other examples, all these other excuses to not to go to war, but in a way he's avoiding people to be humiliated, to people to be looked at, oh, he's a sinner, that's why he's not going to war, he thinks he's going to die. And so even in that, the Lord is sensitive to the issues of the individuals, which I think is something that's very nice of him. Verse 10, when you advance on a town to attack it, first offer it terms for peace. If it accepts the terms for peace and opens its gates to you, then all the people there are to be put to forced labor and work for you. So here's going to be a difference between the people that are in Canaan. The people that are in Canaan, which is the area that's going to be the promised land, the Lord said, all those people in that land, you are to kill. But other nations that are outside of those nations, if you encounter them, before you go into war or do anything, you're going to offer peace. If that nation accepts your peace, then you don't do anything against them, but they will be basically enslaved to you, or they will have to pay tributes to you. They belong to you, but you don't do anything bad to them. But if you say, offer them peace, and it says in verse 12, however, if they refuse to make peace with you, but prefer to make war against you, you are to put it under siege. When Adonai your God hands it over to you, you are to put every male to the sword. However, you are to take as booty for yourself the women, the little ones, the livestock, and everything in the city, all its spoil. Yes, you will feed on your enemy's spoil, which Adonai your God has given you. So if they go to this nation, they offer peace, and the nation does not accept the peace of Israel, then they go to war, and God is going to give them the victory. And once they have the victory, they have to kill all the males, but they can take the women, the children, the livestock, and use that spoil for themselves. Verse 15, this is what you're to do to all the towns which are at a great distance from you, which are not the towns of these nations. In other words, it's not the nations that make up Canaan. And he's going to say, which are these? For those towns that are part of Canaan, it says, as for the towns of these peoples, which Adonai your God has given you as your inheritance, you are not to allow anything that breathes to live, contrary to the other nations. These nations you have to completely destroy. Rather, you must destroy them completely, which is the term cherem. Remember, we have talked about that before. Cherem is when something's dedicated to the Lord for destruction. You cannot take anything from there for your own use. That belongs to the Lord, and the Lord requires that it be destroyed. The Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusites, all the ites, all these people Adonai your God has ordered you, so that they won't teach you to follow their abominable practices, which they do for their gods, thus causing you to sin against Adonai your God. So these nations, these 7 nations, which make up the promised land, they have to be completely destroyed. If they leave any of them, the issue is that they're going to be influenced by them. They're going to fall into idolatry. They're going to follow their practices, which is, the Lord wants to get rid of all of that. And we know, if you ever read the book of Joshua, we know that many of these nations were not completely destroyed. They were left there. And so what happened? Israel got intermingled, intermarried, and fell into the trap and followed many of their idolatry practices. Verse 19, when in making war against a town in order to capture it, you lay siege to it for a long time. You are not to destroy its trees. Cutting them down with an axe. You can eat their fruit, so don't cut them down. In other words, because remember, when they went to war, this didn't happen overnight. They just fought and then it was over with. Many times a war could last years because they first sieged the city, waited until people ran out of food, out of water, they got sick, and then they went in and made war with them. So he's saying, don't cut the trees that have fruit. You're going to need them to eat from them. After all, are the trees in the field human beings so that you have to besiege them too? However, if you know that certain trees provide no food, you may destroy them and cut them down in order to build siege works against a town making war with you until it falls. So the trees that had no fruit, you could use these to make shelter, to use them for ramps or whatever, but the trees that produce fruit, those you not destroy. And remember again, that trees are likened to humanity. Chapter 21. If in the land Adonai your God is giving you to possess, a murder victim is found lying in the countryside. So now this is again related to justice and righteousness. Why? Because they found a person that was killed and they don't know who killed the individual. And the perpetrator of the murder is not known, then your leaders and judges are to go out and measure the distance between the murder victim and the surrounding towns. After it has been determined which town is the closest, the leaders of that town are to take a young female cow that has never been put to work or yoked for its use as a draft animal. So the thing is here, they find a body, they don't know who killed that individual. And so in a way, they have to do a ceremony that is kind of like to clean themselves from guilt because they don't know who did it. They know they didn't do it, but they find this individual, so they have to go through this ceremony. And they need a young female cow that has never been put to work or has never had a yoke on it. In other words, similar to the red heifer in a way. The leaders of that town are to bring the heifer down to a body with a stream in it that never dries up, to a place that is neither plowed nor sown, and they are to break the cow's neck there in the body. In other words, we know it's not an offering because of the way they killed the cow. In other words, they have to basically cut its head off, break its neck. It's not an offering because it's not a kosher slaughter. So they have to kill the cow in a place that it has not been plowed or sown. And then in verse 5, it says, the priests who are Levites are to approach. For Adonai your God has chosen them to serve him and to pronounce blessings in the name of Adonai. They will decide the outcome of every dispute and matter involving violence. All the leaders of the town nearest the murder victim are to wash their hands over the cow whose neck was broken. Then they are to speak up and say, this blood was not shed by our hands, nor have we seen who did it. Adonai, forgive your people Israel, whom you redeemed. Do not allow innocent blood to be shed among your people Israel, and they will be forgiven this bloodshed. Thus you will banish the shedding of innocent blood from among you by doing what Adonai sees as right. So this is part of the process of maintaining justice and righteousness. They find a dead person, they don't know who killed them, and so they do the ceremony to cleanse themselves of innocent blood. But the commentary says that eventually they find out who really killed this individual. That individual has to pay for what he did. So it has to go to judgment. But in the meantime, this is a way of keeping the land from having innocent blood shed on it. So they did this ceremony. Okay, with that, that is the end of this Torah portion. We're going to take time for some questions or comments. I'll be stopping the recording. So Shabbat Shalom.